Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander into the shadowy corridors of palaces and ancient dining halls, where the plates looked golden, the wine shimmered ruby red, and yet every single bite could be the last. Imagine sitting down at a royal feast, the room echoing with laughter, goblets clinking together, the smell of roasted lamb and honey drifting across the table. Everyone is smiling, but in the back of their minds, they're wondering, did the chef slip in a little something extra tonight? You probably wouldn't survive this job, and honestly, neither would I, but someone had to try. Someone had to take that first bite and see if the king's supper was a meal or a murder attempt. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And since I'm curious, tell me in the comments where you're rewatching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's strange to think that entire kingdoms relied on this peculiar line of work. The royal taster, imagine the tension every evening in a great hall lit by torches, musicians playing gently in the corner, and the king's personal cupbearer, who was more than just a servant tracing a chalice to his lips. One sip, one swallow, a pause, all eyes locked onto his face, waiting to see if he twitched, coughed, or keeled over. Only when he survived, when he calmly set the cup down, could the ruler drink without fear. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or mostly symbolic. Some records from ancient Mesopotamia suggest that cupbearers were not merely poison testers, but also trusted advisors. People so close to the king that their loyalty was unquestionable. Being a taste tester was both a death sentence and a promotion. It meant you were close to power, but you were also a shield of flesh between the monarch and every grudge-bearing cook, every ambitious courtier, every shadowy assassin who slipped powders into stews. In Rome, emperors like Claudius and Nero are said to have employed entire squads of such testers. Claudius, ironically, still died from poisoning, or at least that's the rumor. Some say mushrooms were the culprit. A royal taste tester supposedly approved them first, which makes historians debate. Did the system fail, or was the tester bribed? Poison was subtle. It didn't always strike instantly. Some mixtures took hours, even days, to work, meaning that tester might have eaten right alongside his emperor, smiling as both of them unknowingly ingested slow death. But the job wasn't all grim suspense. It carried prestige. A trusted taster often had a seat closer to the ruler than generals or ministers. In Persia, cupbearers could whisper in the king's ear while handing him his drink. Alexander the Great had one, and the role was considered so noble that poets compared cupbearers to divine attendants. Still, that glory didn't erase the simple truth. Every meal was Russian roulette with food. Now picture the sensory details of such a moment. You lift a steaming plate of spiced lamb. The spices hide strange undertones. Cinnamon, maybe something less familiar. You breathe in deeply, and part of you wonders, does that faint bitter edge mean it's saffron? or does it mean someone wants me gone? The king is watching. He won't eat until you do. You cut a piece, chew slowly, and smile, praying the cook's hands were honest today. The room waits, suspended, before life continues again. Oddly enough, not every culture used tasters to prevent death. Some used them simply as quality control. Ancient Chinese courts reportedly employed specialists who sampled food for freshness. If it spoiled, they'd catch it before it reached the emperor's lips. Spoiled meat could be just as lethal as poison in those times. So in a way, it was all the same, ensuring the ruler's survival. There are fringe stories, quirky little notes tucked away in chronicles that describe taste testers developing rituals to ease their nerves. Some supposedly whispered prayers before each bite. Others kept charms in their sleeves. One tale says a servant of a pharaoh wore a small amulet shaped like a scarab beetle, believing it could ward off toxins. Whether these charms worked or not is lost to history. But perhaps they gave courage to someone facing the possibility of death 3 times a day. 3 times a day. Of course, there's a debate around whether poison was as common as we imagine. Modern scholars point out that while the stories of poisoning in royal courts are dramatic, they might have been exaggerated. Maybe a rival dynasty wanted to make their enemies look paranoid, weak, or cursed. But paranoia was real, and perception was power. If a king was seen as too cautious to drink his own wine without a tester, maybe it showed he was constantly under threat. If he drank freely without one, maybe it proved strength, or maybe it proved arrogance. And think about the testers themselves. They lived in the strange middle ground between luxury and doom. They ate the richest foods, drank the finest wines, but each bite was edged with risk. They might die younger than the average farmer, yet they lived in palaces instead of huts. Some were probably slaves, forced into the role. Others were nobles whose loyalty was being tested in the most literal way possible. Yod-Hai, woe, crocodile dung, sunscreen trick from ancient Egypt. The taste tester's life was another reminder of how far humans would go to feel secure. Cover your skin in dung to block the sun. Feed your servant poison to block your enemies. It all fit into a world where trust was fragile and danger lurked in every corner. Let's slow it down for a moment. Picture one evening in Babylon, the ziggurat looming against the night sky, the palace gardens glowing with torches, fountains trickling. Inside, a banquet stretches across long tables. The tester, a young man with careful eyes, lifts a goblet of dark red pomegranate wine. He drinks. Silence. The king tilts his head, waiting. A heartbeat passes. Another. The tester smiles faintly, hands back the cup. The king finally sips. Conversation resumes, and life continues just for tonight. Tomorrow, the ritual repeats. It makes you wonder what kind of personality survived in such a role. Calm nerves, blind faith. A taste tester couldn't flinch, couldn't grimace, couldn't choke on a bone and scare the entire court into panic. His body language had to radiate reassurance, even if his stomach turned somersaults inside. Maybe that's the real skill they were hired for, not just survival, but the ability to convince a ruler that all was well. And that's the odd balance these strange jobs carried. Half necessity, half theatre. The king needed food to be safe, but he also needed the spectacle of safety. Watching another man eat in his place wasn't just about poison, it was about power. It was a statement that said, even here, in my own hall, I'm too important to risk a single bite. The taster's sacrifice made that visible. As we drift forward, think about how many other roles were built this way, half practical, half symbolic, often bizarre. Taste testers may have faded out of modern courts, replaced by science and health inspectors. But in those days, they were the human shield of the dinner table. A strange job indeed, and yet one kingdoms couldn't seem to function without. If you walk barefoot across the cold stone floors of a grand temple at dawn, you might notice something odd. They are spotless, gleaming as though polished by invisible hands. That wasn't magic, though the worshippers probably believed it was divine. It was the result of an entire workforce whose sole purpose was sweeping, scrubbing, and dusting the sacred spaces. The temple sweeper may not sound like the most glamorous role, but in ancient kingdoms it was surprisingly important. After all, if you believed the gods actually lived in those halls, you didn't want them tracking dust through their own house. Imagine the rhythm of it: brushes swishing, water sloshing, soft echoes of cloth against altar stone. Before priests arrived to perform chants, before incense curled into the air, the sweepers had already been at work for hours, making sure every surface gleamed. They weren't just janitors. Their labor was considered devotion. Cleanliness equaled purity, and purity meant the gods might actually hear your prayers instead of ignoring you. In Mesopotamia, temple workers came in hierarchies. At the top were priests who communed with the gods. At the bottom were cleaners who communed with brooms. And yet, in the cosmic sense, their jobs were connected. If the altar was dusty, if offerings rotted, if floors turned grimy, it wasn't just messy, it was insulting to the divine. A dirty temple could bring famine or floods, or so people believed. So, while the sweepers weren't honored with songs or statues, they carried the quiet pressure of preventing cosmic disaster. There's an odd little tidbit recorded about Egypt's great temples. Some sweepers used palm fronds, tied together to polish the flagstone floors until they shone like water. At Karnak, where towering columns reached sky high, the floors were scrubbed daily with water carried from the Nile. It must have been back-breaking work, but also strangely meditative. Picture yourself pushing water across stone, hearing the faint squeak of reed bristles, watching sunlight from the temple doorway dance across the wet surface, over and over again, until the temple looked as though it had never seen dust in its life. Historians still argue whether temple sweepers were slaves, volunteers, or lower-ranking staff within priesthoods. Some say common citizens could offer sweeping as an act of piety, like donating labor instead of money. Others argue it was a permanent role, often given to orphans, captives, or those born into temple households. Whatever the origin, the task itself was so necessary that no temple functioned without it. Even the most elaborate rituals needed a foundation of cleanliness. There's a certain theatrical side to it too. Visitors walking into a freshly polished temple would be awed not only by statues and incense, but by how utterly immaculate everything appeared. That visual impression reinforced the idea that this was a space set apart from ordinary life. A grain of sand on your hut floor was just daily annoyance. A grain of sand near a statue of Amun or Ishtar might be cosmic disrespect. And of course, humans being humans, some sweepers probably found ways to make the job more interesting. A quirky note from Roman temples suggests that sweepers sometimes carved little doodles in hidden corners, tinny graffiti tucked under altars, where no one important would look. While the priests chanted above, below the stone you might find a scratch drawing of a donkey, or a quick tally mark of how many days in a row someone had been on duty. The gods got their shiny floors, and the sweepers got their secret signatures. Yod Hi-Wo Tester's calm smile when eating suspicious lamb. The sweeper's equivalent was the silent satisfaction of walking out after a long shift, knowing the gods would never notice them, but the priests would panic if they didn't show up. Invisible workers, yet absolutely necessary. There's something soothing in picturing its temple corridors quiet, except for the swish of reeds, torches flickering, the faint smell of smoke from yesterday's offerings. A sweeper pauses, leans on his broom, watches a thin beam of light creep across a carved wall. Maybe he whispers a little prayer of his own, asking the gods to notice, just once, the hands that kept their floor from turning to dust, and perhaps, without realizing, those sweepers shaped history. Because a well-maintained temple lasted longer, impressed visitors more deeply, and kept rituals flowing smoothly. Without them, religion might have looked messier, less awe-inspiring. Clean floors built faith just as much as sacred chants. Strange job. Yes, but imagine the world without them. Now imagine a ruler waking in the middle of the night, sweat dripping from his brow, heart racing after a vivid dream. He saw a river flowing backward, or a lion swallowing the moon. Or perhaps just his mother-in-law offering him figs with a strange grin. In our modern world, he might brush it off or call it indigestion. But in the courts of ancient kingdoms, such a dream could change policy, launch wars, or decide whether a palace servant lived or died. And for that, the king needed specialists. The official dream interpreters. These were not casual fortune tellers peddling vague predictions at a market stall. These were learned men and women, often trained for years, who kept enormous catalogues of dream symbols. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets preserved entire libraries of dream interpretation, thousands of entries, each symbol carefully paired with a meaning. Dream of eating dates, prosperity. Dream of a collapsing wall, disaster. Dream of standing in the rain. The gods are trying to purify you. Some interpretations were oddly specific. If a man dreams of drinking warm beer, it might mean his wife is plotting something. Convenient for a paranoid ruler, isn't it? Historians still argue whether kings truly believed every dream carried divine weight, or whether interpreters were just a convenient way to dress political decisions in spiritual clothing. After all, if you already wanted to invade a neighbor, it was handy to announce, "The gods told me in a dream." Instant justification, no questions asked. But at the same time, ancient people genuinely feared dreams as portals to the other world. Ignore them, and you risked offending the gods. Picture the atmosphere in a royal chamber, the king pacing, describing a dream in detail while scribes write it down. The interpreter listens, nodding gravely, stroking his beard. Then consults clay tablets like a doctor checking symptoms in a manual. Perhaps he pauses dramatically before announcing, "Your Majesty, the gods show favor if you build a new temple, but beware, for an enemy waits across the river." The king sighs with relief, or else stiffens with dread, and suddenly everyone's week has changed. There's a quirky tidbit from ancient Egypt that pharaohs often kept dream books under their pillows. Handwritten guides filled with interpretations. Imagine trying to sleep with a thick papyrus manual shoved under your head, just in case the gods drop by with a message. Some priests even claimed they could induce meaningful dreams by sleeping in the temple, near statues of gods, a practice called incubation. Basically, an ancient version of saying, "Dear gods, please send me a useful dream tonight, and don't waste my time with nonsense about dancing donkeys." Of course, not every interpretation was safe. Get it wrong, and you might offend the ruler. Tell him his dream of falling meant humiliation, and suddenly he feels insulted. Tell him it meant victory, and he might reward you or march straight into a disastrous battle. Interpretations were a dangerous balancing act between honesty, flattery, and survival. One fringe anecdote describes a Babylonian king who dreamt of a river turning to blood. The interpreter, perhaps feeling bold, told him it meant his enemies would drown. The king rejoiced, but in truth famine struck that year, and the poor drowned metaphorically in misery. That interpreter likely vanished soon after. Was he wrong, or did the king simply not like the outcome? Hard to say. In such jobs, truth often bent to power, and yet dream interpreters had remarkable influence. They were, in a way, ancient psychologists, listening to the hidden fears of rulers, cloaking them in divine metaphors, and shaping decisions from those anxieties. Some were trusted enough to serve as long-term advisors. Others became scapegoats when predictions failed. Either way, their strange profession kept palaces buzzing with symbols and omens. Yod Hai Woe, quiet temple sweeper polishing floors so gods wouldn't feel insulted. The dream interpreter polished something else, the king's mind, scrubbing nightmares into orderly prophecies. Both jobs dealt with invisible dirt, one on stone, the other in imagination. Picture yourself drifting into sleep in a dark chamber, hearing the muffled sound of flutes outside. You dream of standing in a field of snakes, their scales glinting like moonlight. You wake, terrified. Tomorrow, a solemn figure with ink-stained fingers will explain what it means. Maybe it's a warning, maybe it's a blessing. Maybe it's just the beer you drank too late. But you'll never shake the feeling that your dream wasn't really yours, that someone else will shape your fate from it. And that was the peculiar power of this strange job. Interpreting the chaos of the subconscious into the order of politics. In doing so, they kept kingdoms running, sometimes wisely, sometimes disastrously, but always with the quiet authority of those who could claim to know what the gods whispered at night. You hear it before you see it. The long, piercing cries of grief that rise and fall in rhythmic waves, echoing across the streets as a funeral procession winds its way toward the city gates. The mourners closest to the bier may be genuine family, clutching their robes, wailing for real. But many of those voices in the crowd are not kin at all. They are professionals, hired women whose job was to cry as loudly, dramatically, and convincingly as possible. These were the funeral wailers, strange specialists who turned sorrow into a craft, and in doing so helped kingdoms navigate death and dignity. The idea may sound odd to us today, but in ancient societies, grief was both a private feeling and a public duty. The louder the mourning, the greater the honor for the deceased. Hiring wailers ensured that no funeral was ever quiet or shamefully small. If your family couldn't muster enough tears, you could rent them. And not just tears, there were gestures, chants, hair-pulling, sometimes even self-scratching to draw blood. Pain was performed, staged like theater, but the belief was that it pleased the spirits of the dead and showed the living that this person had been significant. In Mesopotamia, professional wailers are mentioned on clay tablets, their voices linked with the goddess of lamentation herself. In Egypt, tomb paintings show lines of women bent over in exaggerated postures of grief, hands raised to the sky. The Bible, too, makes reference to mourning women who were summoned when someone died. Historians still argue whether these women were truly respected or simply tolerated as necessary noisemakers. Some evidence suggests they could be paid quite well, especially for elite funerals. Others hint they were marginalized, living on the fringes until called upon to howl for the dead. Imagine the scene in a bustling Egyptian street. A nobleman has passed away, and the family arranges a grand procession. Alongside servants carrying offerings and priests chanting prayers, the wailers walk barefoot, hair disheveled, faces painted with streaks of ash. At the right moment, they throw themselves to the ground, beating their chests and shrieking so loudly that onlookers can hear from blocks away. The drama is contagious. Neighbors join in, relatives weep harder, and suddenly the whole street vibrates with sorrow. Whether or not every tear was genuine no longer matters. What mattered was the volume of grief. A quirky tidbit comes from Roman funerals, where mourners were sometimes paid extra if they could name-drop the deceased's achievements between sobs. Imagine sobbing, then pausing mid-wail to shout, "He was generous. He defeated the Parthians. He funded 3 aqueducts," and then collapsing into tears again. A strange blend of resume reading and emotional theater, but effective at reminding everyone that this was a person worth crying for. Of course, not everyone admired the practice. Philosophers like Seneca grumbled that hired wailing was fake, a kind of noise pollution. He thought true grief should be silent, internal. But ordinary people disagreed. They wanted funerals to echo with sound, to send the dead off with a storm of voices. And in that sense, wailers were essential. They were the amplifiers of human sorrow. There are also stories of wailers doubling as guardians of memory. Some of them memorized long dirges that included family histories or local legends, chanting them during funerals so that the community remembered not just the individual, but the larger story they belonged to. In that way, they were like historians, disguised as mourners, weaving continuity out of chaos. Yod-Hai, Wo-King's dream interpreter, turning nightmares into prophecies. The Wailer did something similar for death, turning silence into a performance of meaning. Both gave shape to the ungraspable, one to the mind, the other to mortality. Picture the final moments of a burial in an ancient city. The sun lowers, shadows stretch, and as the body is lowered into the earth or sealed in a tomb, the Wailer's cries rise one last time, reaching a pitch so high it makes your skin prickle. Then, slowly, the voices fade, the crowd disperses, and the mourners walk home. The family pays the women, who quietly return to their own lives, waiting for the next death. Their grief has been spent, their role complete, and the world moves forward with its endless cycle of living, dying, and crying. Strange job, absolutely. But without them, ancient kingdoms would have sounded eerily quiet at the edge of death. Picture a hot Egyptian afternoon, the sun blazing down on mud-brick houses, fields stretching in the distance, and along the riverbanks, a small band of workers with baskets and shovels crouched in the reeds. What are they gathering? Not grain, not fish, not clay. No, something far less dignified. They are scooping up the droppings of crocodiles, carefully collecting the stuff in woven containers, hauling it back to towns where it will be dried, ground, and, believe it or not, turned into medicine, cosmetics, and even birth control. These were the crocodile dung collectors, perhaps the least glamorous, yet oddly crucial job in certain ancient economies. It sounds like satire, but archaeological and textual evidence suggests crocodile dung, mixed with other substances, was indeed used in Egyptian medicine. Ground and shaped into pessaries, it was thought to act as a contraceptive. Modern science has since raised eyebrows at that claim. Historians still argue whether it actually worked, or whether it was just another ritualistic placebo. But the fact remains. Someone had to fetch it, dry it, and prepare it. And that someone probably didn't get invited to the palace banquets. Imagine crouching near a basking crocodile, the air thick with heat, insects buzzing around your head. You wait, nervously, watching one of the most dangerous animals in the Nile region, hoping it doesn't decide to swing its tail or open those jaws. You're not armed with a spear. You're armed with a basket. The moment the creature slides into the water, you rush forward, scrape up what it left behind, and scurry away before it decides to come back. The job was equal parts dangerous and humiliating, but it supplied material that priests and healers insisted was valuable. A quirky tidbit surfaces from Greco-Roman accounts. Crocodile dung wasn't the only animal waste in circulation. Cow dung, pigeon droppings, even bat guano, all had medical uses. People smeared them on wounds, mixed them into pastes, or burned them for smoke. To us, it sounds repulsive. To them, it was part of an intricate worldview where every natural substance held power, good or bad. In that sense, dung collectors were like pharmacists, in reverse, harvesting raw ingredients for remedies. But crocodile waste was special. Egypt revered crocodiles as sacred to Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of strength and fertility. His temples sometimes housed live crocodiles, fed and groomed by priests. Together, the excrement of such holy beasts may have even carried a twisted honor, dangerous, yes, but blessed. Still, whether people respected the collectors themselves is doubtful. Likely, they were viewed as low-status laborers, anonymous but necessary. Yod-Hi-Wo wailers crying so loudly at funerals to show honor. These dung collectors provided the opposite kind of public service, quiet, smelly, and hidden away. No one praised them, yet their strange work ended up inside the homes of the rich, in the form of cosmetics, or in the temples. As part of ritual medicine, invisible hands, once again, kept the kingdom running. Historians point out a scholarly debate. Did ancient contraceptives, like crocodile dung, actually have any chemical effect, or were they purely symbolic? Some argue the high acidity of the dried substance might have altered the vaginal environment, lowering fertility. Others insist it was just ritual theater. Either way, women trusted it, and trust shaped behavior just as much as science. Now imagine an Egyptian woman preparing for the night. Her maid brings her oils for perfume, coal for her eyes, and a small, crumbly lump of crocodile dung mixture for protection against pregnancy. She applies it without a second thought, because in her world this was medicine, not mockery. Behind that small act lies the unseen figure of a collector who risked his life by the riverbank earlier that week. There's something oddly poetic in that cycle. The crocodile, feared and revered, leaves behind waste. The lowest worker gathers it. Priests and physicians sanctify it. The highest in society use it. From the river mud to the palace bedchamber, crocodile dung traveled like a hidden thread tying together gods, workers, and rulers. And so, while the collectors may never have had statues built in their honor, their strange job reveals something profound about ancient kingdoms. Even the most unglamorous labor could ripple into the most intimate corners of power. Picture a warm breeze blowing across an ancient palace courtyard. The sound is not of chariots clattering or soldiers drilling. It is the gentle buzz of thousands of bees swarming in clay hives stacked neatly along the walls. Tending them is a figure in linen robes, moving slowly, cautiously, with a mixture of reverence and fear. This is the keeper of royal bees, one of the strangest yet most vital jobs of antiquity. Because honey wasn't just a sweet treat. It was medicine, currency, sacrifice, and even immortality sealed in a jar. In Egypt, beekeepers were recorded as early as 2400 BCE. Their hives painted on temple walls. Honey was so valuable that it was offered to gods in golden bowls and buried with the dead as a food for the afterlife. Pharaohs expected steady supplies, which meant someone had to manage those hives carefully. Imagine the pressure fail at your job, and the palace not only lost its sweetener, but its ritual offerings, its healing ointments, even its mummification supplies. Honey was everywhere. The keepers were like royal pharmacists, with stingers for co-workers. The work itself was delicate. Ancient hives were usually cylinders made of clay or woven reeds, lined up horizontally. Beekeepers used smoke bundles of dried dung or herbs set alight to calm the bees. Too much smoke, and you ruin the honey's flavor. Too little, and you're running for your life under a black cloud of fury. Once the bees were subdued, the keeper reached inside with bare hands or crude tools, scooping out golden combs and storing them in sealed pots. No gloves, no masks, no protective suits. Just trust, technique, and probably a lot of stings. A quirky tidbit: Egyptians sometimes paid taxes in honey. That meant beekeepers were indirectly fueling the economy. Historians still argue whether they were free craftsmen or state workers bound to temple estates. Some evidence points to entire villages devoted to honey production, their labor flowing straight into royal granaries. So, while their title sounds quaint, their role may have been closer to that of tax collectors or bankers. Only their currency was sticky and sweet. Honey wasn't the only concern. Beeswax was equally prized. It sealed jars, waterproofed boats, polished furniture, and served in rituals as a symbol of purity. Temples burned beeswax candles in ceremonies, the smoke rising like prayers to the heavens. Without the keepers, these rituals would literally lose their light. And on the medical side, honey was mixed with crocodile dung, herbs, and even ground metals to create ointments for wounds. Its antibacterial properties, real and effective, meant it actually saved lives. The beekeepers were, without knowing it, part of ancient healthcare. Now imagine walking with a beekeeper along the Nile Delta at sunrise. The air is heavy with the smell of wildflowers, lotus, and reeds. The bees rise in clouds, shimmering like dust motes in the first light. The keeper hums softly. Some believed sound calmed the insects and lifts a hive lid. Inside, the comb glows golden, dripping thick honey that catches the sun like liquid amber. He carefully breaks a piece, sets it in a pot, and whispers a prayer to the bee goddess Neith, patron of weaving, because beekeeping, like weaving, required patience and precision. Yod-Hai, woe, crocodile dung collectors, braving danger by the riverbank. The beekeepers faced their own risks. They weren't chased by jaws, but by swarms. A single sting was nothing, hundreds could kill. And yet, they endured it, because their strange job linked them directly to the gods. In some myths, bees were born from the tears of the sun god Ra. That meant each hive was a divine gift, each sting a reminder that holiness demanded sacrifice. There's an odd story from Hittite records. When a treaty was sworn, honey might be poured as part of the oath, symbolizing sweetness and binding truth. Imagine a beekeeper's product sealing international peace. Another from Greek lore tells of honey being fed to infants of noble birth, as if it could shape their destiny toward greatness. Even Alexander the Great, centuries later, was supposedly preserved in honey after death, his body carried across deserts in a sarcophagus of golden syrup. Whether that tale is true or not, it shows the mythical power honey carried on by extension, the odd reverence for those who produced it. The beekeeper's day was a cycle of watching, tending, harvesting, and protecting. He had to guard hives from bears, jackals, and thieves who knew the value of a single jar. He had to keep colonies healthy, sometimes moving them seasonally to fields with better flowers. Some cultures even built rafts of hives floated down rivers, letting bees forage while drifting to new lands. Imagine living in a kingdom where fleets of beehives sailed like miniature naval convoys, escorted not by warships, but by buzzing clouds of loyal insects. Historians still debate the exact scale of organized beekeeping in ancient kingdoms. Was it a centralized royal industry, or more of a cottage craft taxed by the state? The truth may lie in between, but what is certain is that honey appears everywhere, from trade records to temple recipes, and, without someone devoted to managing those fragile colonies, kingdoms would lose a source of sweetness and symbolism that held their culture together. So while the royal taster risked poison and the temple sweeper risked invisibility, the beekeeper risked pain and exhaustion, all to provide something so small and simple: a jar of honey. Yet that jar sweetened bread for kings, anointed wounds for soldiers, burned as light in temples, and flowed into myths of gods and heroes. Strange job, yes, but close your eyes for a moment and imagine the low hum of bees, steady and hypnotic, like the background hum of a fan on a warm night. The beekeeper moves slowly, patiently, hands sticky with gold, the air vibrating with wings. It is a scene equal parts danger and reminder that even the strangest jobs could hold unexpected beauty. Now imagine you're in the middle of a vast palace hall. Torches flicker on the walls, servants shuffle with trays of wine. Guards stand silent with spears crossed, and at the very center, a king leans forward on his throne. The air is thick with tension. Words must be spoken, but not by everyone. No messenger dares shout, no scribe dares blurt. Instead, someone approaches quietly, bends low, and breathes words so softly they barely stir the air. This is the professional whisperer, a strange role in ancient courts where secrets, strategy, and even prayers traveled on the barest edge of a human voice. It sounds theatrical, almost like something out of a stage play, but whisperers really did exist. Their job was not just to carry messages, but to do so in a way that kept them safe from eavesdroppers. In kingdoms where a single overheard phrase could spark rebellion or assassination, whisperers were the human encryption systems of their day. They walked from one chamber to another, leaned into ears, and carried knowledge that might shift the fate of entire empires. Historians still argue whether whisperers were official posts or informal roles folded into court life. Some think they were trusted servants, trained to deliver sensitive orders. Others suggest they were ritual specialists, believed to channel divine will in hushed tones. Either way, their existence points to a world where the volume of a voice mattered as much as the words themselves. Picture a Babylonian court. The king sits uneasy after hearing a troubling dream. He gestures, and a whisperer is summoned. The man bows, his sandals silent on the polished floor. He listens to the king's words, then slips away through dark corridors, repeating them under his breath to keep the memory alive. When he arrives at the priest's quarters, he leans close, his lips barely moving, and the message is delivered. No scroll, no audience, no risk of spies, just the simple, fragile thread of breath. A quirky tidbit from Egypt tells of priests who whispered spells directly into the ears of statues, believing the gods could hear only when addressed with softness. Whisperers in that context weren't messengers for humans, but for the divine. Imagine tiptoeing into a dark temple chamber, standing before a massive stone falcon, and leaning close to murmur a request, as if confiding in a friend. The role demanded intimacy, secrecy, and a kind of performative humility that louder forms of speech could never achieve. Of course, not every whisper was benign. In Greek courts, rumor and gossip traveled by whisper too, and sometimes professional attendants were suspected of planting information as much as carrying it. Historians still debate whether whisperers were trusted or feared. A servant who lived in people's ears could be both an asset and a threat. If you relied on them, you relied on their memory, their discretion, and their loyalty. If they turned against you, your secrets became weapons. Yod-Hai, woe beekeeper, handling fragile combs, trusting bees not to swarm. The whisperer handled fragile words, trusting that ears wouldn't betray them. One sting from gossip, one slip of the tongue, and reputations collapsed faster than hives raided by bears. The skill itself must have been oddly specialized. Whisperers had to be clear without being loud, precise without stumbling, and confident enough that the recipient believed the message truly came from the king. Imagine leaning so close to a general's ear that you smell the leather of his armor, while he stands perfectly still, listening to orders that will send thousands of men into battle. The moment is intimate, yet carries the weight of life and death. And then there's the psychology of whispering. To this day, a whisper feels different than a shout. It draws you closer, creates a bond, forces you to focus. Ancient rulers likely understood this instinctively. A whispered order wasn't just secret. It was personal. It made the recipient feel chosen, trusted, perhaps even favored. In a court full of pomp and public decrees, whispers were the hidden veins through which power truly flowed. There are fringe tales too, like that of a Persian courtier who supposedly could whisper so softly that only one chosen ear could hear, even in a crowded hall. Whether that's humanly possible or just legend, the image lingers: a man speaking secrets in plain sight, yet invisible to everyone else. Another story from India tells of attendants who learned to whisper poetry into the ears of kings at bedtime. lulling them into dreams shaped by carefully chosen words. Was it comfort? Was it manipulation? Hard to say. But it shows how whisperers occupied that delicate space between servant and infant. Picture yourself at the edge of a great throne room. The noise dies down. A whisperer walks past, head bowed, lips moving faintly as though reciting to himself. He stops at the throne, bends close, and delivers the message. The king nods once. No one else hears, and yet, in that small exchange, history shifts. Maybe an army marches tomorrow. Maybe a rival is executed at dawn. Maybe peace is sealed in silence. Strange job, absolutely. But it reminds us that kingdoms didn't always run on speeches shouted from balconies. Sometimes they ran on breath, on murmurs, on words carried from one ear to another, fragile as wings in the dark. Now step away from the throne rooms and temples for a moment, and picture something far more ordinary yet no less essential. A quiet courtyard behind a palace, the sun rising, a line of servants already busy. And among them are women bending over stone basins, beating garments against flat rocks, plunging fine linens into steaming vats of water scented with herbs. They are the royal laundresses, the hidden hands who kept kings and queens from walking around in dusty, wrinkled, or heaven forbid stained clothing. At first, the job might sound simple, just wash the laundry. But palace garments weren't ordinary tunics. They were woven with rare dyes like Tyrian purple, trimmed with gold thread, embroidered with sacred patterns, and sometimes perfumed with oils. Cleaning such things wasn't just housework, it was chemistry, ritual, and high-stakes performance rolled into one. A laundress could not afford to ruin a robe that symbolized divine authority. One blotch, one faded thread, and suddenly she had insulted both the king and the gods. Historians still argue how organized these teams were. Some believe laundresses belonged to guild-like groups within the palace. answering directly to overseers who kept strict inventories. Others suggest they were attached to temple households, since many rulers blurred the line between political and religious duties. Either way, the laundry staff operated as a small army of workers dedicated to making the ruler's appearance flawless. Picture their daily rhythm. Dawn. Filled jars with water, sometimes carried long distances if the palace lacked its own supply. Heat the water with wood fires. Mix in natron, a mineral salt common in Egypt, or ash-based soaps in Mesopotamia, or even fermented urine in Rome. Yes, urine. The ammonia broke down stains, and while it sounds unpleasant, it worked remarkably well. In fact, Roman laundries, Folenike, were so dependent on it that they placed collection jars in public areas for citizens to donate. A quirky but true tidbit, Emperor Vespasian even taxed the urine trade, turning laundry into revenue. The phrase, "money doesn't stink," is said to come from that policy. Back in the palace, laundresses rubbed, wrung, and rinsed cloth until their arms ached. The work was back-breaking. Fine linens had to be beaten against smooth stones without tearing. Woolens were combed with teasels to fluff them back to life. Dyes had to be refreshed with plant extracts, a process requiring careful timing so the color didn't streak. And then, once garments were clean, they were dried under the sun, pressed with hot stones, and perfumed with oils or resins. Imagine a queen's gown laid out in a courtyard, sunlight catching its shimmering weave, while attendants fanned away dust and insects. Yod high woe whisperers carrying fragile words into ears. Laundresses carried fragile garments into water and fire. Both worked in secrecy, unseen by the public, yet their mistakes could ripple loudly through the palace. Imagine a royal banquet beginning, and the king stepping out in a robe still blotched from yesterday's feast. Scandalous. The laundress responsible might find herself demoted or worse. But it wasn't all fear and drudgery. Laundry work had its own rhythms of camaraderie. The women likely sang as they scrubbed, their voices echoing across stone courtyards. Some songs may have carried double meanings, half work chant, half gossip about court life. After all, who else but laundresses saw the private stains and secret perfumes of the palace? Their hands brushed against the most intimate fabrics, the kind that told stories about what rulers ate, where they went, and sometimes what they did in the privacy of their chambers. There's a fringe story from Assyria that some laundresses were occasionally questioned as informal spies. If a robe smelled of incense from a forbidden temple, or carried ash from a strange fire, they were the first to notice. Did all laundresses gossip? Probably. Did they sometimes hold dangerous knowledge? Almost certainly. That's the paradox of their strange job. They were lowly in status, but close to the personal lives of the most powerful people alive. A laundress's tools were humble. Basins, stones, wooden paddles, combs for wool. And yet, those tools shaped appearances that projected divine majesty. Kings were seen as near gods, and gods didn't wear dirty tunics. If the robes gleamed white, if the colors dazzled, the ruler looked untouchable. If not, the illusion cracked. Clean clothing was propaganda, and the laundresses were its invisible engineers. Imagine one at the end of her day. She sits on a low stool, hands raw from salt and soap, hair damp with steam, clothes spattered with water. Before her lie rows of garments, now gleaming clean, folded neatly, ready to be carried back into the palace. Tomorrow they'll be worn under torchlight, admired by courtiers, immortalized in paintings and statues. No one will think of the laundress who scrubbed them. Yet, without her, the ruler's glory would be spotted, wrinkled, imperfect. Strange job. Yes, but just like the temple sweeper, the laundress ensured the sacred illusion of kingship stayed intact. No dust in the temples, no stains on the king bee, 'cause in ancient kingdoms, even dirt could be political. Step into a small workshop tucked into the back streets of an ancient city. It doesn't look like much, just a bench, a fire pit for light, and piles of wood and clay stacked neatly in baskets. But here, a man bends over with a sharp blade, carefully carving tiny notches into a stick. He counts under his breath, marks again, pauses, and double-checks. This isn't art. This is accounting. He is a census stick carver, one of the overlooked specialists, who kept kingdoms running by, recording the very people who made them up. Long before printed records or spreadsheets, population data had to be tracked by hand, and sometimes by objects. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed numbers into clay tablets. But in smaller administrations or border regions, sticks carved with tallies were more practical. Each notch stood for a person, a family, or even a taxable unit like a herd of goats. These sticks became a strange hybrid of memory and object carry one to the palace. And it was as if you carried the entire head count of a village in your hand. Historians still argue how standardized these systems really were. Some suggest carvers worked under direct palace supervision, ensuring tallies matched taxes. Others think they were more like freelance craftsmen, trusted because of skill and reputation. What's certain is that kingdoms could not function without knowing who owed labor, who owed grain, and how many soldiers could be conscripted. A single census stick could determine whether fields were properly taxed or whether an army marched with enough men. Imagine the detail. A carver receives a bundle of wood-straight rods cut from tamarisk or palm. He smooths the surface, then begins to cut. Short, shallow lines for individuals, deeper cuts for households, cross-hatches for livestock. The sound of the blade against wood is steady, almost hypnotic. Each mark is a life represented, a small scar in wood that stood for someone's place in the machinery of the state. A quirky tidbit, in some regions, notched sticks were split lengthwise into two identical halves. One half stayed with the palace, the other with the local official. Because the grain of the wood was unique, the halves could later be fit back together like puzzle pieces to verify authenticity. Imagine an ancient official slapping two sticks together like Lego bricks and saying, "See, it matches." These people really do exist, and they really do owe taxes. In fact, this method of tally sticks survived well into medieval Europe, where England used them for tax records until the 1800s. Now, picture the census day itself. Families line up, children fidgeting, elders leaning on canes. The carver watches, counting carefully as each household steps forward. A soldier or overseer calls out numbers. With each group, the carver adds new marks to his stick. He knows the weight of his blade determines the weight of their burden. One wrong tally could mean extra taxes for a poor farmer or too little labor demanded for the king's next building project. Accuracy was survival. Yod Hiwo laundresses who held rulers' reputations in their hands. The carvers held the people themselves, reduced to lines on wood. Both jobs were invisible to glory, yet crucial to order. One cleaned garments, the other cleaned chaos into lists. There's a darker side, too. These sticks weren't neutral. They were tools of control. They told the palace how many men could be taken for war, how many women for temple service, how much grain must be surrendered each harvest. To hold the census stick was to hold a miniature map of obligation, and yet, to the carver, it was just work. Cut, notch, count, repeat. Historians still debate whether the carvers themselves were literate scribes or simply skilled artisans. If they were literate, they straddled the line between bureaucracy and craft. If not, then they were tools of the literate, carving by instruction but never interpreting. Either way, their strange little sticks became the bones of administration, the silent ledger of an empire. Now, picture one evening, the carver sitting alone after a long day. His hands are rough, fingertips sticky with resin. He holds a finished stick to the firelight, tilts it, and sees the shadows of notches dancing across the wall. To him, it's just marks. But, in truth, those marks will travel to the palace, be matched, and decide how the kingdom moves. An entire nation's weight rests on tiny cuts, the simplest scratches carrying the heaviest consequences. Strange job, certainly. Yet, without census stick carvers, kings would have ruled in the dark, unaware of how many subjects they commanded. And a king who didn't count, sooner or later, would be the one counted out. The palace courtyard roared with life, not from soldiers or servants, but from the sounds of creatures that had no business being in the middle of a city. Imagine a leopard pacing restlessly in an iron cage, an elephant lifting its trunk to trumpet, or brightly feathered birds shrieking in strange foreign cries. Ancient kingdoms often displayed power not just through armies or monuments, but through living trophies. Exotic animals brought from far-off lands as gifts, tribute, or spoils of conquest. And someone had to take care of them. Enter the palace animal tenders, men and women whose strange job was to keep lions, monkeys, camels, parrots, and other exotic beasts alive in a place they were never meant to live. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, records describe foreign rulers sending exotic animals as tokens of diplomacy. A Babylonian king might receive a bear from the mountains, or an Egyptian pharaoh a giraffe from Nubia. These creatures were not just curiosities, they were propaganda. To show them off in the palace garden or parade them in festivals proved the ruler's reach extended beyond his borders. But behind the spectacle, animal tenders faced the daily grind of feeding, cleaning, and preventing chaos. Historians still argue whether these tenders were professional specialists trained in animal care or ordinary servants forced into the role. Evidence from Assyrian reliefs suggests some were highly skilled, able to walk lions on leashes, harness wild horses, or coax elephants to obey. Other records, however, show animals dying quickly in captivity, suggesting caretakers often learned through failure. Picture one of their mornings. The sun rises, and the tender makes rounds through the palace menagerie. First stop, the cages of baboons, restless and noisy, demanding fruit. Next, the leopard, pacing back and forth, eyes gleaming in hunger. The tender tosses in a goat haunch, careful not to get too close. Then, the elephant, which needs water, hauled in massive jars. Hours pass before the animals are satisfied, and all the while, the tender risks being bitten, trampled, clawed, or simply overwhelmed. A quirky tidbit: Egyptians revered certain animals as sacred, like cats, ibises, and crocodiles. Temples even bred them in large numbers, but the palace menageries leaned toward exotic, non-native animals. Records show that Ramses II kept a giraffe. In Assyria, kings boasted of lions in their gardens, sometimes staging hunts where the king killed the beast for sport, while tenders released it from its cage. Imagine being the poor servant whose job was to open the door and hope the lion ran toward the king instead of doubling back toward you. Yod high woe census, stick carvers turning lives into tallies. The animal tenders turned wild chaos into order. Both handled raw material, one human. One beast transformed into something that symbolized control. Historians still debate the ethical perception of these menageries. Were the animals admired, pitied, or feared? To common people, seeing a giraffe or elephant must have felt like witnessing magic. To rulers, they were walking proof of empire. But to the tenders, they were daily chores. Cleaning dung, repairing cages, nursing sick animals. Imagine having to splint a monkey's broken limb with strips of cloth, or finding herbs to calm a camel with stomach trouble. Sometimes these animals played roles in festivals. Parrots might be taught to mimic phrases. Elephants dressed in garlands. Lions paraded through streets in chains. The tenders trained them as best they could, often with crude methods. A lion refusing to obey wasn't just disobedience, it was an insult to the king's authority. Punishment might fall not on the beast, but on the handler who failed to control it. And yet, there must have been moments of quiet connection. A tender feeding a monkey each morning might earn its trust. A bird might perch on his arm willingly. Perhaps an elephant learned to recognize the sound of his voice, rumbling in greeting when he arrived. In a world where most people never traveled far, Tending exotic animals was like holding pieces of distant lands in your hands. Picture it now. The palace garden at twilight, torches glowing, nobles strolling while marveling at the strange sights. They point at a giraffe stretching its neck, laugh at monkeys swinging from ropes, or gasp at a lion pacing behind bars. The king smiles, basking in their awe. But off to the side, half hidden, stands the tender sweating, exhausted, one eye always on the locks of the cages. If the animals stay calm, the night ends well. If not, chaos erupts, and he is the first in danger. Strange job, without question. But in a kingdom where animals symbolized dominion over nature and neighbors alike, palace animal tenders carried the quiet burden of making sure those symbols didn't starve, escape, or bite the wrong person. Without them, the king's garden of wonders would have been a garden of corpses. Imagine walking into the royal kitchens of an ancient palace. Fires roar, pots bubble, and servants rush to and fro with trays of bread, roasted meats, and pitchers of wine. The air is thick with the smell of garlic, onions, cumin, and smoke. Yet, amid all the bustle, there is one group of specialists whose job wasn't cooking at all. They were the food aromatizers, the peculiar professionals hired to make meals smell better, stronger, or, in some cases, simply different than they really were. Their task was to turn dining into theater, masking the less pleasant realities of ancient food supplies. Why did kingdoms need such workers? Because food preservation in antiquity was unreliable. Meat spoiled quickly, wine soured, fish turned rancid. Even the best storage methods, salting, smoking, sealing in jars, couldn't keep everything perfectly fresh. But appearances mattered. A king couldn't be seen wrinkling his nose at a foul odor. Guests couldn't gag at a banquet where foreign ambassadors were present. Enter the aromatizers, who used herbs, resins, perfumes, and smoke to transform questionable dishes into culinary illusions. Historians still argue how common this practice was. Some scholars think it was reserved for elite feasts, where the pressure to impress was highest. Others believe everyday kitchens used aromatics as routine tools of survival. In either case, evidence shows that spices like cinnamon, cloves, and cardamom traveled vast trade routes, sometimes valued more than gold. Their worth wasn't only taste, it was disguise. Picture an aromatizer at work. He enters the kitchen carrying small pouches filled with dried herbs and exotic powders. A pot of fish stew smells just a little too sharp. He sprinkles crushed coriander and fenugreek, stirs it in, and leans over with practiced nostrils. Better, a tray of roasted duck seems bland. He drizzles rosewater and honey across the skin, transforming its scent into sweetness. Wine has soured. He burns a pinch of resinous frankincense nearby, letting the smoke mingle with the air so that guests notice the perfumed haze before they notice the temps. There is a quirky tidbit from Rome. Cooks sometimes used flaming torches dipped in resin to waft strong scents across a hall just as food was served, overwhelming less pleasant odors. Imagine sitting at a banquet, a servant sweeping by with what looks like a fiery baton, and suddenly the room smells of pine and spice instead of questionable pork. Another trick was to serve meals in heavily scented rooms, where garlands of flowers and bowls of herbs distracted the nose before the food even arrived. Yod-high woe animal tenders, keeping wild chaos presentable for the king's garden. Food aromatizers did the same with meals, turning spoiled or ordinary fare into feasts worthy of gods. Both jobs were about illusion, maintenance, and hiding the flaws behind power's glittering mask. The work wasn't without danger. If an aromatizer failed, guests might fall ill or worse, blame him for poisoning. If he overdid it, suspicion grew. Why does this wine smell so heavily of myrrh? Was it to hide something deadly? In courts already paranoid about treachery, a badly timed sprinkle of spice could doom a worker's career. And yet, the craft required remarkable knowledge. Aromatizers weren't random servants throwing mint leaves into pots. They studied how ingredients interacted with heat, with oils, with smoke. Some may have been connected to temple perfumers, borrowing techniques from incense rituals. After all, if you could mask the stench of animal sacrifice with sweet-smelling smoke, you could mask the staleness of fish just as well. Imagine the sensory spectacle of a royal feast enhanced by these specialists. Platters of lamb arrive, glistening under honey glaze, the scent of cinnamon wafting through the air. Bowls of lentils are sprinkled with asafoetida, giving them a garlicky punch. Fruit trays gleam, dusted with powdered sugar and rosewater, so fragrant they seem impossibly fresh. Guests murmur approval, believing they are eating the finest produce of the land, never realizing that behind the scenes, a team of aromatizers battled with nature's decay. Historians still debate whether their work was acknowledged openly. Were they celebrated as artisans, or were they invisible? Their tricks considered too shameful to admit. One theory is that palaces pretended food was always fresh, and so the men who masked its flaws were kept in the shadows. Another suggests they were prized as culinary magicians, discreetly rewarded for keeping rulers' reputations intact. And sometimes the role blurred into luxury. Even when food was perfectly fine, aromatizers elevated it with fragrances meant to delight rather than conceal. In Persia, saffron was sprinkled into rice until it glowed golden. In India, rosewater and cardamom turned deserts into perfumed delicacies. In China, tea leaves were sometimes stored with fragrant blossoms, infusing the drink with subtle aromas. These weren't disguises, they were enhancements, pushing dining into the realm of sensory theatre. Picture, for a moment, the quiet pride of an aromatizer after a banquet. He sits in the kitchen corner, the chaos of dishes piled high, the fires dimming. He dips his hands into a bowl of herbs, breathing in the faint scent of mint and cloves. The king is happy, the guests impressed, the palace reputation intact. All because he mastered the art of air, the invisible craft of smell. Strange job, absolutely. But kingdoms don't just run on armies and taxes. They also run on illusions of freshness, of abundance, of perfection. And the food aromatizers were masters of illusion, turning spoiled into splendid, and suspicion into applause. The palace is silent at midnight, yet a single flame flickers in the darkness. A young servant sits cross-legged on the cold floor, cradling a torch. His eyes sting from the smoke. His arms ache from holding it steady, but he does not dare let the fire go out. This was the life of the torch-bearers and flame-keepers, those whose strange duty was to guard light itself. Night after night, year after year, in kingdoms where fire wasn't just warmth or light, but a symbol of eternity, protection, and divine order. In ancient temples and palaces, fires weren't allowed to die. In Egypt, a sacred flame burned for Ra, the sun god. In Greece, the eternal hearth of Hestia blazed in city centers, tended by priestesses called the Vestals. In Persia, Zoroastrian fire temples kept flames alive as pure embodiments of truth and divinity. Each of these required watchful hands, people assigned to feed the flames, shield them from drafts, and rekindle them if danger loomed. A kingdom without its fire was a kingdom without favor. Historians still argue whether every palace truly had a continuous flame, or if the practice was symbolic. But records and myths alike suggest that many courts employed entire staffs of attendants to ensure fire never failed. For rulers, it was both practical and theatrical. A banquet needed light, a temple needed smoke, a city needed reassurance that divine fire still burned in its heart. The keepers of flame became, in a sense, guardians of the kingdom's soul. Imagine the detail of their work. Each evening, torches had to be trimmed, soaked in oil, and lit. Wood had to be selected carefully to damp, and it sputtered. Too resinous, and the smoke choked the room. Coals had to be banked in ash to keep embers glowing until morning. During festivals, fire might be carried in processions, with torchbearers forming glowing rivers through city streets. To stumble, to drop a torch, to let one go dark, these were not small mistakes, but omens of misfortune. A quirky tidbit: Roman Vestal virgins were punished harshly if the sacred flame of Vesta went out. One account says a Vestal who let the fire die was whipped, as if the gods themselves required punishment to relight their favor. Imagine the pressure of being a young woman, whose only job was to keep coals alivened, knowing that a single lapse in attention could mean disgrace. Yod-high, woe food, aromatizers, masking spoiled flavors with perfume. Flamekeepers masked darkness itself, creating the illusion that light was endless. Both roles worked in the background, invisible until something went wrong. If a dish stank, guests noticed. If a torch went dark, fear rippled through the crowd. Now imagine being a torchbearer in a royal procession. You stand in line with others, each holding a long, smoking brand. The king passes by, and your torchlight illuminates his jeweled robes, making him seem larger than life. Without your light, his splendor fades into shadow. And yet, you are faceless, nameless, a hand trembling beneath the flame that glorifies him. Historians still debate whether these attendants were slaves, priests, or soldiers. In some accounts, temple boys were chosen to tend sacred fires as training for priesthood. In others, torchbearers were commoners, hired only for festivals. But what's clear is that the role mattered because fire itself mattered. It was the heart of ritual, the center of spectacle, the warmth of daily life. Picture one late night in a Babylonian ziggurat. The city is asleep, silent except for the distant barking of dogs. A single flame burns atop the tower, visible for miles. A keeper paces, feeding it with oil, eyes heavy with exhaustion. He mutters prayers to Shamash, the sun god, asking for dawn to hurry. To him, it is a long, weary night, but to the city below, it is reassurance that their world is in order, that the gods are still watching, that chaos is still held at bay. There's even a fringe belief, whispered in some traditions, that firekeepers absorbed holiness from their duty. They inhaled sacred smoke, their skin absorbed its warmth, their souls became guardians themselves. Others feared the opposite, that too much time near sacred fire made them uncanny, half human, half divine, forever marked by smoke. Did torchbearers believe these things? Maybe, or maybe they just wanted a nap. Strange job, yes, and yet strangely beautiful. The flamekeeper lived in silence, his face lit by glow, his life bound to something bigger than himself. He did not fight wars or make speeches. He simply fed fire. But by doing so, he kept gods alive, kings honored, and people reassured. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. A torch in the dark, crackling softly, the smell of oil and wood drifting in the air. a keeper sitting beside it, breathing with the flame, both of them holding the night together until dawn. The palace courtyard smells of incense, wine, and something more metallic thick, coppery, unmistakable. In the center stands a block of stone, its grooves dark with old stains. Priests chant, drums throb, and beside the altar, a man in a linen apron steadies his hands on a clay jar. He is not a priest, not a butcher, not quite a physician. He is a collector of blood, one of the strangest and most unsettling jobs that ancient kingdoms required. His task was to gather, store, and prepare the life essence spilled during sacrifice or surgery, so it could be offered, preserved, or even consumed. In cultures across the ancient world, blood carried profound meaning. It was life itself, sacred and dangerous. In Mesopotamia, it sealed covenants. In Egypt, it was part of medicine and magic. In Rome, gladiators' blood was rumored to cure epilepsy. And in Mesoamerica, entire rituals revolved around collecting and offering blood to the gods, whether from captives or from the rulers themselves. To handle blood was to handle the line between mortality and divinity, and someone had to do the messy work. Historians still argue whether dedicated blood collectors truly existed as a formal role, or whether priests, physicians, and servants rotated duties. But inscriptions, jars, and ritual texts suggest specialists must have been present, for the scale of some ceremonies required steady hands. Imagine a great festival with dozens of animals sacrificed in sequence. The priests might recite prayers, but behind them stood workers catching streams of blood in jars, stirring it with salt to keep it from clotting, or mixing it into concoctions for later use. Picture the detail: the warm splash of blood filling a shallow bowl, the steam rising in the cool air, the collector's fingers stained to the nails. He has to work quickly. If the blood clots, it can't be poured smoothly onto the altar. If it spills, It might anger the gods or, at least, the priests. He tilts the bowl carefully, pours into a jar, seals it with wax, then places it in a row with others. Each vessel is labeled by memory. Ram, bull, dove. He knows which blood is destined for medicine, which for sacrifice, which for secret rites. A quirky tidbit comes from Egyptian medical papyri, which prescribe animal blood for treatments mixed with honey to soothe sore throats, or smeared on wounds to stop bleeding. Other recipes are stranger. Lizard's blood as an ingredient in love charms. Pig's blood used to ward off evil spirits. Whether these worked or not, people believed in them, and collectors supplied the raw material. Yod-Hi-Wo flame-keepers tending fragile fires all night. The blood collectors tended another kind of flame, the lifeblood itself, caught before it vanished into the dirt. Both jobs were about preserving what should never be lost, whether fire or life. Of course, the work carried dangers. Blood could spread disease, though ancient people didn't know why. Collectors also risked being scripted. If someone fell ill after drinking a remedy, suspicion might fall not on the healer but on the man who gathered the substance, and the psychological toll handling the blood of both beasts and men must have been heavy. Imagine dipping your hands into a jar still warm from a sacrifice, day after day. At some point, it stopped being shocking and became routine, which is unsettling in its own way. There are darker notes too. In gladiatorial Rome, some cellars near arenas bottled fresh blood from fallen fighters, hawking it as cure or charm. Who collected it? Likely low-status workers with jars, rushing into the sand after the bodies were dragged away. In Aztec ceremonies, the blood of captives was carefully caught on strips of paper or in bowls, then presented in offerings. That work could not be entrusted to amateurs. The kingdom's spiritual survival depended on precision, and yet, amid the strangeness, there was reverence. To collectors, blood wasn't just fluid, it was currency, medicine, offering, proof of devotion. They were the unseen accountants of sacrifice, measuring out life itself. Picture one at the end of a long festival. He kneels by a row of clay jars sealed with wax, each filled with dark liquid. His apron is stiff, his hands raw, his nose numb to the smell. The priests chant final prayers, the crowd disperses, and the jars are carried to temple cellars. Tomorrow, some will be mixed into potions, others smeared on altars, others buried beneath foundations as blessings. The collector stretches his sore back, mutters a small prayer of his own, and slips away. No one will remember him, but his work will echo in rituals long after. Strange job, absolutely. And yet, without the blood collectors, kings could not seal covenants, priests could not feed gods, and healers could not brew their odd remedies. They were the hidden hands of life and death, guardians of a substance that was at once terrifying, holy, and indispensable. The hall is buzzing with tension. Courtiers murmur in corners. Generals glare at one another. The king sits heavy on his throne, his mood dark. Suddenly, a figure tumbles into the center of the floor, hat jingling with bells, face painted in silly streaks, tunic patched with bright colors. He trips deliberately, crashes into a servant, and sends a tray of figs flying. The crowd gasps, then bursts into laughter. Even the king cracks a smile. Crisis softened, tension dissolved. This is the work of the professional jester, a strange yet essential role in ancient and medieval courts, making rulers laugh. Yes, but also speaking truths others dared not voice. Though we often imagine jesters as medieval clowns, their roots run much deeper. Pharaohs employed dwarfs and fools for amusement. Babylonian kings kept entertainers who mixed music with satire. And in China, records speak of court jesters who cleverly used humor to sway emperors' decisions. These were not just performers, they were pressure valves for kingdoms, diffusing anger with laughter, balancing fear with foolishness. Historians still argue whether jesters were prized advisors or disposable playthings. Evidence points both ways. Some enjoyed real influence, like Yu Shi, a Chinese jester who once persuaded the emperor not to waste money on a colossal palace project by mocking the absurdity of it. Others were humiliated daily, the butt of cruel jokes themselves, forced to swallow insults for the amusement of the court. Survival depended on wit, timing, and the fickle moods of their royal masters. Imagine the detail of their craft. A jester studies the king's face before he speaks. Is the ruler furious? Then a gentle joke, deflecting anger. Is he weary? And a bit of slapstick, a pratfall with exaggerated groans. Is he proud? Then maybe a sly pun that flatters while poking fun. Every gesture, every word is calculated beneath the mask of foolishness, a quirky tidbit. In some courts, jesters were allowed to say things no one else could. They could mock the king's temper, point out corruption among officials, or criticize policies, all under the safe cover of just joking. It was both protection and peril. Say too little, and you seemed useless. Say too much, and you risked banishment or worse. Humor was their shield, but it was made of glass. Yod-high, woe-blood collectors who handled life's most sacred fluid with careful hands. Jesters handled truth the same way, delivering it drop by drop, wrapped in laughter so it didn't burn. Both worked at the dangerous intersection of necessity and risk. Picture a banquet late at night. The wine has flowed too freely. Voices are rising. The jester leaps onto the table, balancing on a plate, wobbling dramatically as he imitates the general's swagger or the priest's long-winded prayers. The hall erupts in laughter. The king slaps his thigh and wipes tears from his eyes. In that moment, the jester has done more for peace than any guard. He has turned wrath into mirth. But it wasn't all comedy. Some jesters were musicians, acrobats, or storytellers. They memorized epics, sang ballads, or juggled flaming torches. Their role was entertainment in the broadest sense, keeping the ruler's spirits light and the court's energy vibrant. Yet, even in those lighter duties, there was strategy. A jester who entertained well could secure patronage, gifts, and protection. One who failed might find himself discarded. There's a fringe story about a Persian jester who was once asked what he thought of the king's new robe. He paused dramatically, then said, "It looks so fine, sire, that it hides the wrinkles in your face." The court gasped, expecting punishment. Instead, the king laughed until he cried. That was the tightrope jesters walked. Daily truth balanced on absurdity, survival balanced on laughter. And then there were darker moments. Some jesters were dwarfs or people with disabilities brought to court because their differences amused rulers. Their presence raises uncomfortable questions about cruelty and exploitation. For them, laughter was not always a choice, but a burden. Their job wasn't just performance, it was survival under the gaze of power. Imagine one at the end of a long day. The court is empty, torches sputtering low. He sits alone, hat with bells tossed aside, his face painted with fatigue instead of joy. For hours, he made others laugh, deflected tension, spoke truths disguised as nonsense. Now he exhales, silent. Tomorrow, the show begins again. His strange job doesn't appear in official records, but without it, kings may have cracked under pressure, and courts may have drowned in silence. Strange job, undoubtedly, yet jesters reveal a truth about kingdoms. Power needs laughter. Even gods, in myths, enjoy tricksters, those who poke holes in arrogance. And so, in the heart of palaces, amid blood, fire, and politics, a fool in motley rags held a power stranger and subtler than most generals. Night folds over a city like a blanket, and the smallest sounds suddenly matter. The slow drip of water in a stone bowl, the distant bark of a dog, the measured footsteps of someone carrying a lamp. In pre-industrial kingdoms that depended on seasons and the sun, civic life needed rhythms, and someone had to mark them. That someone was the official timekeeper, the person who counted hours, tolled bells, tended water clocks, polished sundials, and kept the tacit schedule that made markets, courts, and rituals run on time. picture a figure on a tower at dawn, wind tugging his cloak, watching a sundial's shadow creep across carved markers. He notes the position in an ink-stained ledger, descends to the square, and strikes a bell to announce the market hour. At night he checks a clepsydran inverted vessel with a calibrated hole measuring intervals as water falls. Or he murmurs over a coil of incense whose burn marks indicate the passing of minutes. A mainstream fact. Ancient societies relied on sundials, gnomons, and clepsydrae, long before mechanical clocks appeared in Europe. And East Asian courts developed incense and candle clocks for nocturnal measurement. Timekeeping was practical and social. A city without synchronized hours would be small chaos. Stalls would open unpredictably. Temple rites would collide, and the scheduling of labor or tax collection could not be coordinated. Magistrates and monarchs, therefore, invested in instruments and people. In some places, a timekeeper was a civic official paid from the treasury. In others, the role bordered on priestly duty, with temple attendants maintaining ritual hours that tied civic life to sacred calendars. That ambiguity made the job both technical and ceremonial, equal parts artisan and ritual functionary. Beyond devices, human practices mattered. Bell ringers, gong beaters, and tower watchers gave communal rhythms their sound. Harbor timekeepers coordinated tides and watch rotations so ships sailed at safe hours. In Islamic cities, municipal timekeepers synchronized prayer calls and market openings so devotion and commerce did not collide. A quirky tidbit: in some port towns, merchants actually contracted specific timekeepers to open markets at agreed times, effectively buying a predictable schedule for trade and gaining small but reliable advantage. The timekeeper's duties braided into many of the other strange jobs we've met. The whisperer needed to know when palace doors closed to pass sensitive words. The torchbearer kept ritual fires for precisely timed ceremonies. Temple sweepers arrived early to make altars pristine for the priest's arrival. You can picture an elaborate backstage choreography in which the census stick carver, the laundress, and the keeper of bees all checked the same clock before their shifts. So the palace's pageant unfolded without visible seams. Timekeeping could be political theatre. A sovereign could assert authority simply by delaying the bell, keeping a city waiting to demonstrate who decided the hour. Just as a royal taste tester altered the immediate risk calculus at a meal. A ruler's decree about when work began could reorient an entire economy. Minutes and hours became instruments of governance. Not only measures, but levers. The craft demanded knowledge. Timekeepers learned rudimentary astronomy, geometry, and the slow mathematics of erosion, drip rates, and burn speeds. They adjusted sundial tables for seasonal declination, cleared silt from clepsydra orifices, and tested incense coils for consistent burn. Some served at observatories, where priests and scholars recorded planetary motions and proposed calendar reforms. The Roman calendar reform under Julius Caesar, which standardized months to better align with the solar, Year shows how states formalized time to coordinate agriculture and administration. There were ethical gray zones. Stories, some apocryphal, speak of timekeepers bribed to ring bells early for favored traders, or of watchmen paid to delay a watch so an ambush met a half-asleep gate. Whether true or exaggerated, such tales underline how governance was woven into time. A single miscount could ripple outward. Soldiers marching at the wrong hour, temple rites mistimed, a ship missing, a crucial tides, small errors multiplying into real disasters. The human rhythm of the work shaped solitary lives. Many timekeepers kept inverted schedules, awake while the city slept, alone with a lamp and a bowl that whispered its measure. Some were ex-priests, used to vigils. Others were meticulous artisans, patient as lacemakers. Apprenticeship transmitted the craft, not patterns for incense, calibration techniques for clepsydra, angle tables for sundials. Their notebooks sometimes survive as fragments, offering later readers glimpses of weather anomalies or market irregularities, tiny records of everyday order. Historians still argue whether official timekeepers were primarily secular technicians or ritual specialists rooted in temple life. And the answer likely shifts by place and period. That debate matters because it changes how we imagine their authority. Were they neutral, functionaries of civic infrastructure, or priests whose timing enforced cosmic order? In truth, both models coexisted in different times and places, which is why the role feels so strange. The night thins into a gentler dark, and the city seems to loosen its shoulders as if breathing out after a long day. Soft lamplight pools in courtyards and doorways, and small sounds become kindly companions. A distant footstep, the rustle of cloth, the sigh of a bell fading. Imagine the person who kept the hours finally sitting down, hands still warm from tending water, and wick eyelids dipping with quiet satisfaction. Because the bell will ring on time tomorrow too. Hold that image gently. The slow drip of a water clock, the thin curl of incense smoke, the hollow note of a bell that once announced a market hour. All ordinary things arranged with care. Match your breathing to that rhythm. Slow in, slow out, as the world narrows to the hush around you. Know that chores were done and rituals completed, that markets stilled and fires banked, and that an invisible order will wait for morning. There is no need for urgency here. What matters tonight is continuity, the patient repetition that stitches days together with calm hands. Feel the tenderness in the smallest labors. Polishing a sundial, trimming an incense rope, cleaning a bell. Acts that hold communities in a gentle cadence. Let the hush fold around you like a soft blanket, smoothing edges of thought and making room for rest. Sleep with the knowledge that some things are being kept for you while you spoop. The hour, the market, the quiet promise of morning. Now breathe deeper, let the last tensions unspool, and allow your thoughts to dim into the slow cadence of a distant bell. Let the city's gentle pattern carry you, so that when you wake, the world will be waiting, patient and precise. Good night, and rest without hurry now.